Hello, everyone. I'm Anthony Pereira. I'm the director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University, and I'm delighted to moderate this first webinar of the year that we conduct with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. And this is the third year of our series of webinars. And today we're going to discuss U.S.-Caribbean relations from trade to economic partnership. We've got a fantastic panel arranged. We've got a presentation by Ambassador Richard Bernal. I should say that members of the audience will be able to present written questions via the Q&A on Zoom. So we're looking forward to your questions after the presentation and the comments from the commentators. I'd like to now turn things over to Georges Fariol to say a few words on behalf of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. Georges is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and formerly served as the vice president for grants operations and evaluations at the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you, and over to you, Georges.
Thank you, Professor Pereira, Tony. So on behalf of the Caribbean Policy Consortium, CPC, I am indeed pleased to help launch this webinar. In fact, as we push ahead into our third year of webinars and research publications collaboration with the Latin American Caribbean Center at FIU, and also I should add, starting a new phase with the center's new director, Professor Pereira. We look forward to a continuing productive collaboration, and thank you for your continuing support in this endeavor. As we launch into this sort of new third year of 4 seminar series, today's discussion really starts off with a critically important element in U.S.-Caribbean relations, trade and economic relations. Arguably, while the U.S.-Caribbean policy universe is rich with multiple layers of interaction that we're all familiar with, ultimately, it may be the depth, the scope of trade and economic partnerships that very well defines the shape and the character of U.S.-Caribbean relations in the years to come. It is significant as a point of departure that in the last several decades, the Caribbean has shifted, in fact, in this arena from a balanced trade partner with the United States, exporting, importing goods more or less evenly and growing annually through several decades, to now being in regional import of U.S. goods, the #1 regional import of U.S. goods in the Americas, and therefore, by definition, also the lowest exporter of goods. There are significant exceptions in the region, the Dominican Republic and Haiti, mostly due to manufacturing, free trade zones, and agribusiness trade, but the CARICOM market as a whole has fallen behind and has yearly trade deficits with the United States. So this is really one of the key issues here that is on the table. Obviously, the COVID pandemic has compounded the situation, although tourism, non-tourism service markets in the region are growing again. Overall, cumulatively, this impacts the economic sustainability and resiliency of the region. So today's seminar really hopes to raise some analytical and policy issues related to this for the future of U.S.-Caribbean relations, especially as the Biden administration is moving to implement several economic development-related initiatives and proposals that emerged from the interaction with the region that emerged from the last June's 9th Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. So our goal today really is, I think, to plant the seeds of thought, of action for a new Caribbean trade paradigm, perhaps, that reflects these sort of new emerging realities and competencies as we move ahead into the 2020s and allows for a more sustained and sustainable trade growth relationship and interaction between the Caribbean and the United States. I think we have, as Tony mentioned in his introduction, a superb panel to discuss all of this. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Georges. I think you're absolutely right about the panel, and I'd like to introduce each of the members before we begin. Ambassador Dr. Richard Bernal is a professor of practice at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of West Indies. He's a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and a principal research fellow at the P.J. Patterson Institute for African and Caribbean Advocacy. Ambassador was Jamaica's ambassador to the U.S. for 10.5 years, chief trade negotiator for CARICOM for 7 years, member of the board of directors of the Inter-American Development Bank for 8 years, pro-vice chancellor for global affairs at the University of West Indies. I wish the ambassador was still in that post because we'd love to do more with the University of West Indies at FIU. He has degrees in economics and a degree in a master's in international public policy at University of West Indies, Penn, New School, Johns Hopkins, author of 6 books and over 100 articles, and a member of the Order of Jamaica. And our first discussant after the presentation by the ambassador is Andrea Ewart. She's an international trade and customs attorney and policy advisor. She's operated DevelopTradeLaw LLC since 2003. She's a member of the bar of Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Florida. That sort of gives me a headache just imagining trying to pass the bar in all of those places. And also admitted to the bar of the U.S. Supreme Court. Has a BA from the Patrice Lumumba People's Friendship University in Moscow, MA in International Studies from the University of Miami, and a JD also from the University of Miami. So for us, you're a local, Andrea, and former president of the Organization of Women in International Trade, and has passed the U.S. Customs broker exam. And our second commentator will be Mr. Eric Wolff. He's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with the rank of counselor. He's currently the regional senior commercial officer for the Caribbean based in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Mr. Wolff has a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania, an MS in chemical engineering from Leahy University, and an MBA from the University of Southern California. Mr. Wolff is a speaker of Mandarin Chinese, which is increasingly relevant, I suppose, in the region, and Spanish, and has served in the Foreign Service in China and North Carolina, but also worked extensively in the private sector in engineering management project leadership and management consulting. So I hope you agree that this is an extremely well qualified panel. And I'd like to turn it over now to Ambassador Dr. Richard Bernal for his presentation on U.S. Caribbean relations from trade to economic partnership. Thank you, Ambassador.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that very generous introduction. You have raised expectations, which I hope collectively we can fulfill. Good morning, discussants, and welcome to all. I'm very pleased and grateful to have this opportunity. It forced me to rethink and to refresh my thoughts on U.S. policy in the Caribbean and on the relationship between the U.S. and the Caribbean. And I think I have some proposals which are maybe new and some might see as not feasible, but I think there is an important moment now which we need to seize on. I have to start by saying that the relationship is a very important one for the Caribbean, perhaps less so for the US. The US policy towards the Caribbean is a subset of its overall foreign policy. And the overall foreign policy of the US seeks a number of objectives. One, we would like to have a peaceful world, a world of democratic countries, a world of private sector led economies and prosperous economies. Against that overall set of goals, how those goals are sought in different regions, of course, differs, reflecting conditions that vary from region to region. In the case of the Caribbean, there is really no clear, unified Caribbean policy. There are actually several different policies for sub-regions. Of course, this takes account of the differences in each country and each sub-region, but it means that there's not an overall template for US policy in the region. For example, in the Caribbean, there's a major difference between US policy to Central America, which is very concerned about migration, as well as growth, democracy, etc., and transnational crime. And the Caribbean has long been democratic, private sector-led economies, favorably disposed to the United States, although there is a growing Chinese influence in the region. Now, in pursuing these, the US makes a difference. Further subdivision, there's a policy for Cuba that has a long distinctive history and centers around sanctions to create more democracy and human rights. There is a separate policy for the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic, apart from being part of the DR-CAFTA trade agreement, has never been an active member in any regional arrangements. Briefly in CARICOM, but as the chief negotiator, I can tell you that was a very tentative arrangement. Now, there's a separate policy for Haiti, very much motivated by the concerns about democracy, national security, migration. And then there's a policy for the CARICOM. In terms of economic support, which the region looks to the US for, there is a big difference in the trade policy. The policy for Cuba is sanctions. The policy for Central America is based on the CAFTA-DR Free Trade Agreement. The policy for the Caribbean is the preferential trade arrangements, which are confined to goods. Aid policies also differ. In the case of Haiti, there's a lot of humanitarian aid. In the case of Central America, national security, which includes migration, is the top motivator. In the Caribbean, the issue is supporting economic crisis, trying to help these countries find a new growth path and to be more resilient to climate change shocks. So there are separate policies in the Caribbean. That may be good in the sense that it takes account of each set of particular circumstances, but it means there's not an overall policy. Now, for the Caribbean and looks to the United States as its main economic partner, largest partner. It looks to the United States for aid. In the case of Central America, I think that case can be clearly made. In the case of CARICOM, and I want to focus on CARICOM, the question is how to support the economic transition which is necessary to keep the Caribbean growing. And that is a different issue. The Caribbean looks to the United States as it's not only its main economic partner, but looks to the United States for the main source of financing development, both direct foreign investment and development assistance. Development assistance for the region has declined in real terms substantially since the halcyon days of the CBI initiative. And the aid has tended to be humanitarian for Haiti, which takes a large chunk, deservedly, of the aid to the CARICOM region. National security support, vital, important because of cybersecurity, money laundering, narcotics trafficking, and transnational crime and violence in the Caribbean, which poses a serious threat to the main industry in the region, which is tourism. The Caribbean has felt that the US can and should do more to assist the region. The US has not always shared that perspective because the US feels these are middle-income developing countries. They are well on the way to economic development, and with the necessary reforms and macroeconomic stability, these economies should be okay. On the Caribbean side, there is a feeling that although per capita incomes are high, the growth process is fragile in the sense that these economies tend to rely on a single source of foreign exchange, which is tourism. In other countries like Trinidad and Guyana, Suriname, there is some diversity and there are possibilities not to rely on tourism. But this is an industry which is very fragile. It's very susceptible to adverse publicity, susceptible to a downturn in the main sources of tourism, UK, Canada, US. Things are not going particularly well in the UK at the moment. The US is struggling with 10% inflation. Canada seems to be going okay, but it looks to the US to support the region because it argues that it is very vulnerable in a complex way which combines economic vulnerability, environmental vulnerability, and environmental vulnerability related to shocks in the region. And the thinking is that the US aid could be more supportive of economic transformation. And the reason that the region argues this is that there's a sort of multidimensional existential crisis which the region is experiencing at this time. The manifestations of this are low and fluctuating growth, and in some cases, actually contractions. Two, the region has suffered from frequent natural disasters. At the top end of the scale would be hurricanes, but lower down there are droughts, there are floods, there are events which are disruptive to economic life. Recall that climate change makes the Caribbean countries frontline countries. The reason for that is they are coastal societies. Most of the population, infrastructure, economic activity, etc., especially tourism, is literally on the beach. And therefore, climate change has a major impact on these economies. The region also now, in trying to manage that process and in the additional expenditure which has been necessary to cope with the COVID pandemic, these countries have again had high debt to GDP ratios. This limits the amount of money the government can put into infrastructure and other projects. And in passing on that, I should mention that while the US is very concerned about growing influence of China, one of the reasons for that is the Caribbean has a major infrastructure deficit as documented by the Inter-American Development Bank. And this is necessary to be addressed if they are to move forward. This deficit is starved of resources because the governments are in a tight fiscal situation with high debt. And incidentally, I should mention that debt management is a problem which has reoccurred in the Caribbean over the last 10, 20 years and continues to be a major issue. Now, it is felt that the US could do more in financial support. And the argument is that the ultimate defense against crime and the bulwark against national security issues is economic development, and the US could put more money into the region at this time when the region is struggling to resuscitate and restart the process of economic growth. I believe that we are at an important juncture. What changes the juncture is, one, the nature of the crisis. In the past, the crisis in the Caribbean related to economic fluctuations, perhaps ignited by a sudden commodity price increase, such as for oil, or the downturn in a commodity export or in tourism. But basically, the region was relatively peaceful, democratic, private sector led, and a region in which the US has a large trade surplus. What has changed now is that the impact of the pandemic on the global economy and the money which was necessary to be diverted to dealing with the pandemic has put a strain, a fiscal strain on these economies, and makes it more difficult for them to bounce back from the economic slowdown. It is taking place and tourism is going, but to be reliant in any economy on a single major export. Incidentally, the other main source of foreign exchange in the region is remittances. Now, I think there's a special opportunity because climate change has raised an important aspect of the Caribbean. Not only is it now threatening and compounding the economic crisis, but I think global awareness of the need to address climate change has improved. We see some major initiatives by the Biden administration. We see the recognition at COP27 of the need for damage and loss financing, for climate resilience financing. And I think this makes it a special, acute time. I believe the US can make an important change in the Caribbean, and I think it should. Now, the Caribbean is small, and therefore the amount of resources which would be required from the US to sustain support in a substantial way over, say, a 5-year period is relatively small. And we notice the amount of resources which can be mobilized in a crisis, as we see the amount of resources devoted to sustaining the Ukraine's resistance to Russian invasion. So, relatively small amount of money. Secondly, the Caribbean is well on the way to economic development. The Caribbean countries are middle-income countries. Democracy is well established, and so also has been private sector leadership. These countries are friends of the United States and look to the United States for its leadership. In addition, the US, while it is the dominant superpower, is concerned about growing Chinese influence in the region. So I think it's a time when there's need for an intervention. I think that it's worth investing in the Caribbean because they are well on the way to development. This is not a situation like Guyana with vast undeveloped resources. It's not a situation like Haiti, which is a situation of massive poverty. It is a situation in which these countries are sort of halfway up the ladder of economic development. And if their momentum could be sustained through this crisis, they may eventually become not just middle-income countries, but relatively high-income small states, which can no longer have to look to development financing and development aid from bilateral and multilateral sources. So I want to propose a new démarche in US policy towards the region. And I say it's an affordable démarche. The first thing I would suggest is that the US policy has been pixelated in the sense that there's national security support, there's economic support, there's support for other causes. They're all operating simultaneously, but they are pixelated, which reduces the impact of the overall. If you look at US support to the region, you would say this is fairly generous, but because it is pixelated, it is not having the overall impact. So the first thing I want to suggest is that all of these aspects of US policy in the region are interrelated, and therefore they need to be integrated in an overall strategy. I say they're interrelated. National security, transnational crime is related to economic development. Economic development is related to how you deal with climate change. Climate change is related to public health vulnerability. So they're all interrelated and they need an integrated approach. That's my first point. The second point is that climate change has finally demonstrated that the countries in the Caribbean are small island developing states, and they are a unique genre. Their problems are not just smallness, vulnerability to economic external factors, but is climate related, and that cannot be postponed. The evidence is that climate change is particularly severe in these islands, and even where you have land, countries which are not islands, Belize, Guyana, Suriname. Belize and Guyana, a lot of the infrastructure is on the coast. They're coastal societies and they're small populations. Now, once it is accepted that these are a unique genre, the following policy actions would constitute an integrated US policy towards the region. First is to mainstream economic and climate related aspects. In other words, to mainstream not only in these economies, but in US policy, that the overall policy when being applied, whether it's national security, public health, economic, whatever, has to take account of this dual reality of economic and environmental factors. You have to mainstream that in US policy. That means that whenever an integrated policy is being developed, the criteria for assessing it is not just democracy, national security, economic, but it's also environmental. So mainstreaming it is the first thing. The second thing is the SIDS in the world are maybe 40-something countries. They're very small. A subset of those are middle-income countries like the Caribbean. It is not a substantial departure to waive the graduation criteria. It is certainly time for that now. The environmental crisis demonstrates that that cannot be the only criteria. It is easy to waive that because we're not talking about big money. We're not talking about a precedent that can be applied for by all developing countries. What we have here is a situation in which a particular limited number of countries have this unique dilemma, and the graduation criteria should be waived on the basis not just of the inappropriateness of middle income per capita, but on the basis of vulnerability to environmental, climate, and weather vulnerability. The third thing I'd like to propose is that the trade policy, which because of the Caribbean's reluctance to move towards a free trade agreement, is largely goods. Goods exports are good for the US, but they're not going to move the Caribbean. The Caribbean's future is in services, and therefore the existing trade arrangements need to do everything possible to make services exports to the US much easier, because this is where the comparative advantage of the quality of human resources in the Caribbean lies. So that's the third thing. The fourth is that the trade policy has to go back to the days of the overall approach of the Caribbean Basin Initiative. It needs to be supported by investment incentives in the US. This could be for a special subset of countries, i.e. the Caribbean, or it could be for a certain period. Remember, the CBI was to be supported by debt relief, investment incentives, and I'm suggesting that much more US investment, direct foreign investment, would take place in the region with the appropriate incentives. That's the fourth point. The fifth point is debt relief really has to be addressed. There is some culpability for the Caribbean countries in getting themselves into serious debt, but it doesn't mean that they do not deserve some relief. I want to suggest that a new template for debt relief would center around what I call debt for damage and loss swaps. In other words, the debt relief resources would be directed to climate resilience and crisis management for weather events. This is not entirely new. You know, I remember in the early 90s when I was ambassador, we lobbied for debt for nature swaps. I think the time is here now for debt for damage and loss swaps. That could be the core of a new debt initiative. My fifth point would be climate change financing. I think that the efforts at COP27, the US could seek to try more climate change financing on a small scale in the Caribbean. If this works, it could then be taken to a wider arena. I think there's much in the Bridgetown initiative with the SDRs at the International Monetary Fund. If you combine this with removing the graduation criteria, you free a considerable amount of resources. My last proposal is that the Caribbean economies are labor exporting economies, and they reap a rich harvest from this labor export because remittances is the #2 source of foreign exchange in many countries. It's a good thing for the region. Yes, there are some loss of skills, but often these people put back more into the economy from outside than they would generate had they stayed and been employed if they would be employed in their local countries. So I want to suggest that when you look at trade, even with the one-way preferences for the Caribbean, the US has a major trade deficit, which means US Caribbean trade, most of the employment that is generated is in the US. One way to share the benefits of this US Caribbean trade is to increase the number of visas for temporary and short-term and seasonal workers. In other words, the US economy, the demographics are such that they need young working people, qualified people. The Caribbean is exporting them. What needs to be done is to bring order to the process. The experience of farm workers and workers in hospitality in the US has been good. Most people do not abscond in the United States. They return to the region, and the seasonal work works for the US, works for the Caribbean. So I want to suggest that part of the sharing of benefits of trade is more employment in the US, which the US needs and the Caribbean also needs. I think I'm right up on my time, so I'm going to stop there, and I hope the discussion will not focus on the difficulties of doing these things, but how can we do these things? None of these proposals are unreasonable. The politics of it may not be the easiest at this time in the US, but I think it's time to raise some of these issues. I go back to my point that it's doable in the Caribbean because you have countries that are able to help themselves. They're halfway up the development ladder. They are small, which means an initiative, even on a new initiative, is small resources and is doable for the US. It's time to do it because if it's done and the Caribbean takes its second step in development, it no longer becomes a region that requires US support on the scale that it now requires. So I stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for giving us such a rich and detailed set of proposals. It's not just an analysis, but it's a set of proposals for us to talk about. And I promise not to sort of keep saying, well, is this feasible, well, etc. But I'm sure that Andrea has lots of insights into this and lots of experience with some of the proposals that have been suggested. So, Andrea, I'd like to turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you, Ambassador Bernal, and thanks as well to the center. And I look forward to the discussion as well. I am in general agreement with the main points proposed by certainly the analysis and several of the main proposals put forth by Ambassador Bernal. I do want to start with some prepared comments where I kind of look at the issue from the CARICOM side. And I have two overarching points, and they are interrelated. They do connect back to Ambassador Bernal's point, so I will certainly circle back there. So my two main points that I want to share: thoughts on how CARICOM can reframe its relationship with the US for the 21st century. And secondly, to pose the question, is it time for a US CARICOM trade and services agreement? So you see, I'm putting the onus here, not so much on the US, but on CARICOM, because I believe that the region does have to bear some responsibility for the status quo that Ambassador Bernal has described so well in terms of the state of US CARICOM relations or US Caribbean relations. So first of all, I believe in being realistic. The Caribbean is a US third border. It is also its backyard. And this is, as happens with any backyard, the region is not and never will be high on the US priority list. And I think Ambassador Bernal's comments capture that very well. So it gets from the US, the region, only the most cursory attention, except where the US believes its security interests are implicated. And traditionally, these security threats have been, and remain up to this point, drug trafficking, illegal migration, and I guess terrorism to some extent. Now, there is an opportunity, I agree with Ambassador Bernal, and I think part of that opportunity, or part of what helps to shape that opportunity, is the presence in the White House of a president who is cognizant of and is paying attention to the newer threats of the 21st century, many of which significantly overlap with the priorities of the Caribbean, again, as Ambassador Bernal alluded to. The existential threat of climate change, our shared vulnerability to deadly viruses, which the COVID pandemic highlighted, and then issues around food security, and then weak points in the global supply chain. So when it comes on to climate change, environmental security, energy diversification in particular, there you have that overlap. And it is no coincidence that these issues were the focus of the initiatives coming out of the meetings of CARICOM heads of government with President Biden at the June Summit of the Americas. Food security is not listed as a White House priority, though it is for the Caribbean, but on the other hand, the US wants to wean itself off its dependence on China as a manufacturing hub of its most sensitive products. And so there could be nearshoring opportunities there for the Caribbean. So in my opinion, these points could provide the core elements of a reframed US policy towards the Caribbean. And I definitely agree, certainly, as you can tell, with Ambassador Bernal that the policy does need to be reframed. The point is, though, that there is, I think, a very narrow window in which to do that, because who knows what the next election will bring. Even if the Democrats retain the presidency, a new White House occupant could have a different set of priorities. And so I believe it is incumbent on CARICOM to take the leadership in articulating where you have these overlapping priority concerns and framing them in the context of shared security priorities, because that is the language that the US understands. I mean, I don't know that we're ever really going to get their attention in any serious way. If we're talking about support economic development and these other wonderful ideas. I mean, I think they're great, but I just don't think, I haven't seen any evidence that it's worked in the past, and I don't think it's going to work in the future. So there is an opportunity right here. And I should say that in the context of trade, again, Ambassador Bernal, I definitely agree on this point. The CBI is outdated, but the ability to consistently renew those components of the CBI that expire every 10 years, or so, the trade preferences for Haiti, and the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act component, which focuses on NAFTA parity and textiles, etc. That consistently gets renewed without much fanfare. And even in 2020, you had a divided Congress, the Trump administration, and of course, a very acrimonious election season, and yet it was renewed. So I think this is evidence of bipartisan support. And this is where the fact of being part of the generally peaceful backyard of the US can be an asset. Because once you agree on a set of policies towards a region, then it's really about maintenance. And so I see this as the primary challenge that we have right now with this narrow window to reframe this existing framework, extend it beyond CBI, which is almost 50 years old. I don't do math very well, outdated, and certainly very much in need of upgrade. But as I said, I think CARICOM needs to be the one to take the lead on this. Why? Because, as Ambassador Bernal stated, because it's a much more important issue to the region than it is to the US, which has all these other issues that it's dealing with. So I should say I'm not privy to what is or is not being done, neither in the US administration or on the part of CARICOM, but our history has been to wait on the US, which I think is a mistake. And when I, for instance, looked at the CARICOM website, just to see what was being said about these economic initiatives that had been agreed on in the context of the summit, I didn't see even a press release. There was nothing there. So I think the region has some complacency, has to accept responsibility for some of the results because of our own complacency. However, the implications of this complacency for the region are much greater than they are for the US. And therefore, CARICOM needs to give this relationship greater attention and focus. To my second point, is it time for a US CARICOM trade and services agreement? I think, so let me say, I hesitate to use the word agreement, and Ambassador Bernal has again provided some great context and background as to why this would be a challenging term. There is a certain rigidity with which the US tends to negotiate trade agreements. However, again, Ambassador Bernal described how important services is to the Caribbean economies. And even in our commodity exporters, such as Trinidad and Tobago, they have strong service sectors. Services is excluded from the CBI, but at the same time, the CARICOM states have already negotiated trading services provisions with the European Union and with the United Kingdom in the form of the Economic Partnership Agreement. And so there are some issues that need to be addressed in the context of services exports to our closest and largest market. Chief among them, I would highlight the need to address portability of professional qualifications. That is state-based. It makes it in the US, it complicates the issue, but it is something, for instance, that has been placed on the agenda for the Trade and Services Agreement, plurilateral, meaning outside of the context of the WTO. So it's not beyond the realm of the US to do that. I think it would be an informative and interesting exercise to look at the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements negotiated with the UK and the EU, and to see what would make sense to extrapolate in the context of trade and services negotiations with the US. I should also say that these negotiations could be an opportunity to address the bank de-risking issues in a comprehensive way, including streamlined rules and technical assistance. So let me close by circling back to some of the specifics of Ambassador Bernal's comments. As I said, I agree for the most part with his comments. In terms of his specific, well, before I get to that, to his question, his point about the impact of US policy being reduced because it is pixelated. I would say that it's not so much pixelated as focused too much on national security concerns. Most of it is channeled through, when you look at the funding, it's channeled through the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, which is about national security, it's about drug trafficking issues. And so that at the same time does support his points about the need to mainstream both environmental, climate change, and economic policy into US policy, along with the other points that I talked about. I agree with the proposal to waive the graduation criteria. And I think my point about the need to negotiate some kind of, I don't know whether you're going to call it an agreement, a protocol, a partial scope agreement or whatever, but something around services exports to make it easier, to make services exports easier to the US. And then finally, in terms of the labor exporting economies, I definitely support that idea. I would also add to that, is specifically the idea of expanding the seasonal visas, the number of visas for seasonal workers. I also think that proposals or ideas that recognize the reality that there is nevertheless a drain on the resources of our economies when we train our teachers or doctors or nurses, and then as soon as they get experienced enough, they are then recruited away from into the US and certainly other developed economies as well. And so I would love to see something that recognizes that by channeling training, money to support the training of teachers, of nurses, of doctors back in the home countries, expanding, in fact, the pool of persons, of these professionals that are trained. Because right now, and I can speak more directly to Jamaica, if it hadn't been for Cuban nurses and doctors during the pandemic, I don't know where we would have been. So the reality is that we do an excellent job of training so many of these professionals who then exercise their personal right to leave, but it does have a negative impact on the economies. And I think this is an area in which to add to the idea of increasing the number of visas for seasonal workers, I see some benefit for providing training programs funded by the US that will expand the pool of persons being trained so that we have enough for our own economies and to export as well. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Andrea, for both reflecting on the ambassador's proposals, but also adding some new proposals for us to consider as well. And I'd now like to turn to Eric Wolff, because Eric, from your vantage point in Santo Domingo, I imagine you have a different perspective on some of these issues.
Well, thank you, Tony. In some ways, yes, but I think I really want to thank and send my greetings to Ambassador Bernal, Andrea, and to the other panelists. I think this is a great discussion. We can share different perspectives. And again, I'm very excited to be here. I just a little bit of background. Our commerce team here covers a very large and diverse region comprised of over 25 different markets with a very strong US export market share around 35%, which again is a major focus area for me. The Caribbean, I like to think of as the United States' third international border, in addition to Canada and Mexico. And due to this, obviously, as already has been expressed, the cultural, economic, and commercial ties are actually quite strong. Again, since US exports are part of my wheelhouse, very happy that we have a very strong US export content in excess of $21 billion, and we have a trade surplus with most countries. So again, I am based here in the DR, but I do represent the entire region, and I do want to talk a little bit about that. I do want to start with the DR. The Dominican Republic is a very strong democratic partner with a population of 10.8 million customers. It actually is the 10th largest economy in Latin America, and actually our largest economy that we track here in the Caribbean. Middle income country, the economy has already been mentioned, is based on tourism, agriculture, free trade zone, manufacturing, mining, real estate, and service industries. A lot of diversification that's going on to try to get outside of tourism and again, broaden the reach. We can talk more about that. The COVID had a major impact upon the tourism industry here, as it did across the region, although the DR did actually see, I think, a stronger rebound than a lot of other markets. Ambassador Bernal already mentioned DR CAFTA. Again, this is a major element for the DR for the trade, which dates back to the mid-2000s, which removed tariffs on most goods and has been a major boon on trade in both directions. Beyond the DR, we also, from my office, we serve what we call 7 partner posts to other dynamic markets, including the Bahamas, Haiti, Jamaica, Barbados, and the entire Eastern Caribbean, Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname. And we also provide advocacy services, which I do want to talk about for infrastructure projects to the Dutch Caribbean. Now, it is important to note that we do have within the Department of Commerce, we have a domestic field. I do want to mention this, that for instance, there in South Florida, we have a very strong, what's called a USIAC, US Export Assistance Center. And so kind of working in partnership with our domestic field, we do have a lot of services that we can provide, including trade events that I do want to talk about to help bring US companies to the markets here. And obviously, we're quite excited about seeing what we can do, advocate and improve and open doors for US clients. It does bear mentioning Jamaica, the importance of this market. Almost 40% of the total goods in Jamaica are American. This is a very attractive market for U.S. exports due to obviously geographic proximity, access to shipping lanes, the large English-speaking population, and very strong cultural and commercial ties. The Bahamas, roughly 85% of total goods and services are imported from the U.S. A huge number. Most Bahamians are familiar, obviously, with U.S. goods and services with very deep cultural ties. These are major, major advantages. And then I do want to spend a few minutes to talk about Guyana and Suriname. Guyana is one of the world's fastest growing economies right now, with a estimated GDP growth of 26% in 2020. That's huge. In 2000, the U.S. Geological Survey identified the Guyana-Suriname Basin as having the second highest resource potential among unexplored oil fields in the world. So this is basically a boomtown down there. I am increasingly finding that I spend a lot of my time on Guyana and Suriname and making sure that U.S. firms have a fair shot at the just infrastructure and other projects that are happening in just about every sector. Now, I do want to mention that I do look at things through a commercial lens. We have many agencies at the embassy here in Santo Domingo and our embassies throughout the Caribbean. These are agencies that look at law enforcement, look at drug interdiction. USAID is huge. Our State Department, political affairs, human rights, defense, et cetera. So again, everything I'm going to be talking about, and I'll try to keep my comments intact here, is through this commercial lens. And really the main thing that I do want to build is a construct that we call America Acts, which basically is three pillars. The first one is competitiveness. So we are trying, well, let me back up a minute. We have a lot of malign actors here in this region, such as the PRC. And we need the America Acts model to make sure that we are putting forward and advocating for solutions that help market-based economies like the US compete here. So first one, competitiveness. Proactive engagement with private sector to validate business case and project viability. Leveraging US initiatives, which include migration, security, and then also, I want to say competitiveness, maximum use of our trade promotion activities, such as missions. We just completed a very successful trade mission in Miami in October, our Caribbean trade mission. Over 200 firms attended the conference, many partners from right there in South Florida. We actually brought 29 US firms for in-person matchmaking here to the markets in the Caribbean. We will have a lot of wins coming out of that. Second pillar, transparency. I wanted to mention energy, oil and gas, and renewable energy is absolutely huge. It was already mentioned about the Summit of the Americas that recently occurred in Los Angeles. By the way, the next Summit of the Americas will be in the Dominican Republic in 2025, which I think is a major signal about the importance of this market and will be a key locus for diplomatic dialogue. But coming out of the Summit of the Americas, June signaled the announcement of the PAC 2030 agreement. The intent of this partnership around renewable energy is to foster adaptation, resilience, and clean energy programs across the Caribbean region. And, obviously, within the USG, we fully recognize the unique and evolving climate and energy challenges, as Ambassador Bernal mentioned, and we're committed to working together on solutions. And we are going to facilitate investment interagency to make sure that the adoption of renewable energies takes place properly. Of course, Russia's war and aggression in Ukraine has disrupted the energy markets and sent shockwaves. We can just see the changes in spot prices of LNG, and due to the dependence upon, again, a lot of different fuel sources from the Caribbean, this has disproportionately affected the Caribbean markets. We also, I want to say, aim to advance procurement reform, in particular the rule of law and transparency. This gets to the transparency pillar. Here in the DR, the single most effective way to combat corruption is to strengthen public procurement. And so we actually, this may sound very technical, but keep in mind, public procurement accounts for around 10 to 15% of GDP in many countries. So we have a major focus here through a whole lot of programs. Last pillar, security. We have a major focus here on port infrastructure development. We have active projects we're working on with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and many of our markets, including the DR, the Bahamas, and Jamaica, to make sure that market-based players actually have access to critical infrastructure. Non-intrusive scanning is another major one. Supply chain security, and then obviously ICT. In ensuring that we want to promote more open RAN and making sure the market-based players have a role here. Obviously, just advocating for sound, safe, and trusted U.S. alternatives. Now, rare earth elements are a major focus area. I'm actually aware of work that's going on in several of our Caribbean markets around identifying, characterizing, and looking and assisting governments with trying to find out ways to exploit rare earth elements. This is an area that is dominated by the Chinese. They actually have a monopoly. Many of these elements go directly into batteries and to needed production to support renewable energy. So we're very focused on making sure that, again, market-based players play a role here. Now, I do want to make a comment that one opportunity is obviously the Caribbean is a key focus for the PRC. And I actually see America Acts on display every single day. Geopolitically, there's 14 countries in the world that still recognize Taiwan. Of these, a large number are right here in the Caribbean and in nearby in Central America. So they are all targets. And diplomatically, there's still a lot going on behind the scenes around gaining influence. We've seen China's tactics. We understand them well. And we have done a lot of things to, for instance, we had a major win in Guyana that just recently, a couple of weeks ago, that focused on the main things. Total cost of ownership is king. Net present value, not the initial purchase price. After sales service, market-based standards. And US firms will do well here. And we have seen some real wins. It's challenging, given the challenges already mentioned about the high debt to GDP ratio, but in the long run, advocating for proper US solutions or market-based solutions. A lot of other European and Asian competitors here that feel the same way about this. I already mentioned about the Guyana gas to shore project, a big thing that we're focused on. So kind of wrapping this up, we want to adapt using the DLT model, a whole of government approach, using a lot of the agencies we have within the US government, not just Commerce and State, but also U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Treasury, the U.S. Export-Import Bank, the DFC Development Finance Corporation, U.S. Trade Development Agency. We have a dialogue with all these firms to make sure that the U.S. is very engaged, kind of from beginning to end, with major infrastructure projects. With advocacy, we have a very active advocacy profile. This is government to government advocacy, where we work and advocate for US solutions with foreign governments. And again, we have 28 open cases across all of the critical sectors. It takes a lot of my time, but it's something that I gladly work with in terms of our ambassadors and other chiefs of mission to make sure that we are putting our best foot forward. It's already been mentioned by others about the challenges here. Energy is a huge factor. We're obviously focusing on renewable energy, and we have a lot of continued focus to make sure that energy security remains a key factor here. Fuel, just the cost of basic fuel and the removing of fuel subsidies we're seeing in some markets is having a major impact, unfortunately, upon just the cost of the basic food basket for a lot of the population. And unfortunately, although we're seeing a lot of LNG and just cleaner fuels that are being brought in with renewables, there's actually, I'm hearing a lot of talk about bringing in heavy fuel oil again, just because, which is kind of disconcerting because of concerns over just cost and supply. But again, PAC 2030, lots of incentives. We need to be looking at more alternatives for solar and wind, battery storage. U.S. Trade Development Agency, we actually have a new grant to help develop battery storage here in the DR, which is a critical part of renewable energy sources. So I will just mention in closing that we are quite excited to work with U.S. companies. We're very excited to work with you all, work with partners to see what we can do to increase U.S. exports and to make sure the U.S. companies have a good seat at the table. You know, it's funny being here, I see some great potential, and I see a lot of markets that are doing some great things to try to leverage their core competencies. Of course, they already have tourism and a lot of things, but here in the DR, they're free trade zones. They're very focused on supply chain, on bringing a lot of these supply chains from Asia. You know, the Bahamas is an area where up until recently, there was a major focus on crypto. You know, the recent collapse of FTZ, I think, has got a lot of the headlines. There's a recent cable that just came out. The title says it all: FTZ's crash leaves a massive crater in the Bahamas' plans for developing crypto. But still, look, we have a lot of very innovative markets. These are governments that understand and want to leverage our deep relationships with the US and find ways that they can build on their competitive advantage in the respective markets. We're excited about that. We want to work with the governments here, just again, make sure that US firms have a key seat at the table as part of the solution. And in terms of trade events, looking forward to hopefully connecting with you all next year. We actually have another major trade mission in Miami coming up in the spring. We have an Enterprise Florida trade mission to Guyana in the March timeframe. So I think there'll be a lot of opportunities that hopefully we can have a way to see each other face to face in the future and promote US trade with the region. So I'll leave it at that. Tony, thank you for the time, and very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Eric. I'm sure I'll be in touch about that trade mission in Miami in the spring. I want to know more about that. But I did want to emphasize too, for those listening in, that we're going to have a segment where we can gather questions and comments through the Q&A function on Zoom. Ambassador, to do justice to your presentation, we're gonna let you have a few brief words in response to the comments. I wanted to abuse my role as moderator and piggyback and just mention two issues which I think are going to betray my ignorance of the region, but I just wanted to bring them up. Eric already touched on it. Is just what is the potential for new digital services to complement tourism and remittances for Caribbean economies? Because it seems like Caribbean countries would have some comparative advantages in that area. And the second issue is there any potential for some of the big Latin American economies to complement the US role for development financing and for other of the issues that you said that, you know, the Caribbean looks to the US for? For example, Brazil and Mexico, is there any role that they could play in kind of filling those gaps that you identified? But it's your opportunity now to respond to the commentators. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the discussions for their very insightful and constructive comments. I will be brief so as to leave as much time for Q&A as possible. First of all, I agree that the US response to the region is affected by CARICOM's own disposition. For example, the reason the trade arrangements haven't been expanded to services is largely the fault of the Caribbean, in the sense that the Caribbean did not want to pursue a free trade agreement. However, they did pursue, and I led the negotiations, an economic partnership agreement with the EU, which includes services provisions. So it's partly the fault of the Caribbean. And I don't want to completely exonerate the US. The US approach was fairly, when I was doing it long ago, was fairly inflexible. It was pretty much, this is the model, the DR-CAFTA model, take it or leave it. There's room for some diplomacy on both sides. The second thing is, the rationale for US aid has come to be dominated by national security in the post-Cold War period. When I lobbied Congress, congressmen were surprised to know how much their state benefited from trade with the Caribbean. For example, people in Baton Rouge didn't understand that this was the main port receiving bauxite and alumina, and where all the grain, the Caribbean imports all its corn and wheat comes through. So often it's not fully appreciated. I want to emphasize this. If instead of looking at the trade deficit with the US, if we looked at services, there would be an even more enormous deficit between US exports and the Caribbean, but it would serve to emphasize the value of the Caribbean market. For example, all the air transport, much of the shipping, the tourism, the cruise shipping, these are all US services exports, and I don't think people understand how important this is to US industry. I want to say that the Caribbean in its approach, I hope I will not offend, but in certain quarters, there's evidence of what I call donor fatigue. People seem to feel, oh, the Caribbean is always asking for aid. But the way to remedy this is for the Caribbean to start off by saying, do you know why we're so important to you? Do you know what the benefits are? Do you know that 50% of every dollar earned by the Caribbean is spent back in the US? We have to shift the basis of, we have to say what is important, why we're important before we make a demand. The last point I want to make is, I am optimistic about the Caribbean's economic future. There is enormous potential. I'm just going to use one example. Healthcare, a fast growing industry in the US, already going offshore because of high costs, dependent on importing medical personnel from all over the world, including the Caribbean, nurses and doctors. It is possible with US investment and US brand names in healthcare for this to go offshore. The benefits are many. One, it reduces the cost of healthcare to US citizens. If health insurance is portable and can be applied elsewhere, and if people are going to brand name places like Johns Hopkins, there is a rim, Bahamas, DR, Jamaica, Costa Rica, where this is very good. It's complementary to tourism, retirement homes, healthcare. We have all the comparative advantage, all the trained personnel in countries like Jamaica to service the healthcare industry. Enormous growth potential. The Caribbean isn't out of options. It's a matter of seizing these options, and that's just one. There's higher education, there's business processing, there are a range of other services which can be provided, but healthcare illustrates the enormous potential, and that can transform not only the export earnings of the region, but it can transform domestic healthcare in these countries. So I stop there to give others a chance to enrich the discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. Lindsay, do we have any questions coming in? Because if we don't right at the moment, George, maybe you'd like to sort of take up where you left off right at the beginning, maybe making some observations or.
Let me jump in, maybe not so much with more observations, but sort of a set of maybe questions or point of discussions, picking up particularly on Ambassador Bernal's notion that there are a lot of opportunities. We just need to kind of focus on that rather than simply focusing on why things can't be done, including here in the United States. I agree with Andrea that there's an issue of timing, but let's put that aside for a second. I wonder whether there's a tension, however, in the emphasis on climate change when several of the economies in the Caribbean, particularly in the Southern Caribbean, are in the near future very much dependent on the expansion of the more traditional energy sectors. So the question becomes, how does that extraordinary development potential, certainly in the near to midterm, somehow not only benefits the kind of the stream of countries going from Trinidad eastward to Suriname, how does it ultimately benefit the region as a whole? Is there some possibility of discussions, certainly within CARICOM, within the Caribbean countries, to spread out, if you will, the riches that may emerge, that will emerge from that sector? And is there a role by the United States to, in fact, enhance, encourage, so that ultimately we find ourselves 10 years from now with having addressed the climate change challenge, which I agree with you is severe, and at the same time benefited from this extraordinary emergence of a potential that can benefit the region as a whole? I'll leave that at, maybe that's a question on the table for now.
I agree with you. One of the things is that the Caribbean integration process only spreads the benefit of economic prosperity in individual countries through trade. That's very limited. What has been missing from the integration process is the integration of capital markets. The region is not short of capital. There are different times in which different countries are doing well. Trinidad, now Guyana, those benefits spread not through trade because we're all producing the same basic goods. What it will spread is when you have a single capital market. If you look at the differential in exchange rates and interest rates in the CARICOM countries, what you notice is that there is no intra-regional flow of capital. And this is where the prosperity from Trinidad could spread. Trinidadian companies invested heavily across the region. Now it's Guyana booming. It's Guyana's time that capital will leave. We want capital to spread in the Caribbean. This single capital market, for example, in the Caribbean, you have a stock exchange in Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, the Eastern Caribbean, and Guyana. We have been talking about a single CARICOM stock exchange since the early 1980s. It's time. The intra-regional flow of capital is what drove NAFTA, is what drove the EU. And one of the important benefits of this is it allows investment across the region, but it also allows the enlargement of Caribbean firms. Caribbean firms are nano firms. They are small by global standards, which means they hesitate. They cannot afford the risk of new investment because one bad investment, they're out of business. They need to enlarge, become regional companies, large enough to then compete on the global stage. So capital flows in the Caribbean is what will spread the prosperity from Trinidad and Guyana to elsewhere in the region.
I wonder also whether there's a discussion that needs to be expanded on this idea of I don't know how to frame it. Several of you have mentioned this, the need to address or restructure, reformat the CBI so that it actually addresses the services sector. This is not a particularly new idea. The question becomes, how can it be done? There was obviously reference to the fact that it exists in relation between the Caribbean, between CARICOM and Caribbean and the EU and the UK. There was sort of clearly an invitation that there is a model here, there are lessons to be learned. Maybe this is a question perhaps for Eric in particular or Andrea. What in fact are the lessons and what in fact is the route that can be productive to move this issue forward in the near future so that we don't discuss this issue again 5 years from now in another webinar?
Trade diplomacy is the key here. I want to refer to an experience with Canada. When I suggested years ago a Canada CARICOM free trade agreement, the region was not as convinced as I was, but the Canadians were willing to do it. One of the things that got in the way is that the Canadians said, for the politics in Canada, we need to call this a free trade agreement. They said, look, this is foreign policy, it's not trade. We're going to give you a generous agreement, but allow us to call it a free trade agreement. The Caribbean said, no, we're not into free trade. We can't call it a free trade agreement. It's these little things that get in the way. When the US and the Caribbean was talking about an expanded agreement, the only format that the US had was the traditional free trade agreement. I think we need to get away from that nomenclature. That's why my notes that I shared with you talks about from pixelation to partnership. If that's why the Europeans didn't call it a free trade agreement, it would never have gotten off the ground in the Caribbean or Africa. But by calling it a partnership agreement, and then by calling it a partnership agreement, you can add the support of capital incentives and development aid, because if you don't address the supply side, it will be an agreement that doesn't benefit the Caribbean. So what is needed here is some diplomacy. Abandon the traditional nomenclature and rhetoric and come with a new approach, which is in which the political environment can be more receptive. And we need to start by saying, do you know how important the Caribbean is to the US economy? And you pitch that to all the East Coast, Miami, Louisiana, etc., grain producing regions, and you say, look, this is important. If you add up services exports with trade exports, the region becomes, the CARICOM region, much less the Caribbean, becomes a major market. It used to be the 7th largest market, but if you add up the services, it may be in the top 5 markets. So therefore, I think if we approach the partnership in a new way, abandoning the old concepts and old nomenclature, there is an opportunity presented correctly. There needs to be flexibility and creativity on both sides, but I think there's an opportunity, there's goodwill, and there's an opportunity for leadership at this time. The trade between Latin America and the Caribbean has been very slow to get off the ground. It's just beginning to happen in regard to the wider Caribbean. Now the English-speaking Caribbean importing a lot of food from Central America, manufacturers from the DR beginning to come into the region, but with South America, very limited. One of the reasons is the deployment of diplomatic resources. Most Caribbean countries are not well deployed in South America, and therefore not much happens. Every year we reiterate the importance and the opportunities, but nothing really happens. It's an opportunity that's going begging. Of course, for countries like Argentina and Brazil, you know, the Caribbean looks like a small market, but if they saw the potential by what the US exports, they would be more vigorous. The Caribbean has nothing to offer these countries other than an import market. Caribbean is not a goods exporting region anymore, except in Suriname, Belize, Guyana, and maybe Trinidad. And that's largely energy and some agricultural commodities. So I think the onus to make the runnings would be in countries like Venezuela, Panama, Colombia, which are fairly close to the Caribbean.
Mhm.
Thanks, Ambassador. Andrea and Eric, would you like to comment on either George's question or the ambassador's response to it? Would you like to add anything? We've got a few minutes left. We've got about 6 minutes left.
I think what I'll do is I hear Ambassador Bernal agreeing with my suggestion about changing the nomenclature. So let's hope we can make some progress around that, because for sure, one of the stumbling blocks has been this rigid approach by the US to negotiating free trade agreements. One of the things that I have found in working around the region on trade issues, and I heard this reflected in your question, George, is the need to accept or to embrace the reality of the existing framework for US Caribbean trade as having been created by legislation. There was nothing negotiated about it. Of course, there would have been input from key sectors of the Caribbean, I'm sure at that time, but it is essentially introduced and kept in place by US legislation. And I remember some years ago, there was a SOCA initiative. What did it stand for? It was about to try to expand the trade preferences framework to incorporate services. And we really met a dead end. There just does not seem to be a whole lot that can be done within the trade preference framework, the existing kind of legislative unilateral trade benefits framework. So if we're going to do anything on services, it is going to require some kind of negotiation and diplomacy that Ambassador Bernal talked about, changes in nomenclature, etc. To your earlier question about the energy resources and so on, I would say that I recently had the opportunity to do some consultations with business support organizations. And in looking at kind of, one of the things we explored were their challenges and their needs and interests around foreign direct investment. And what came up was their desire to attract foreign capital so that they could then work in partnership to address a number of the challenges facing the region. So better, expansion of renewable energy, reducing, even as Guyana and Suriname are becoming oil exporters, they do not want that Dutch disease. They do not want their economies to be dependent exclusively on, remain exclusively dependent on fossil fuels. And so, why has US foreign direct investment been slow in picking up on these opportunities? I think that would be an interesting question to explore. I don't know if Eric has any issues around that, but I would say my sense is in reaching out to explore opportunities to find that capital, looking beyond the US and perhaps some of those other countries that you mentioned, George, as well as Ambassador Bernal. So I'll stop there.
Very quickly, Chair, I want to state, even at the risk of offending the Caribbean, that there are enormous availabilities and potential for solar and wind that the Caribbean is not addressing. I believe that the Caribbean is at fault here. We are 90%, those who import energy, dependent on fossil fuels. From the days of the first oil crisis in the 70s, talk of going to alternative energy, it hasn't happened. There needs to be a program which mandates the government through incentives and other policies, mandate that tourism and other industries located on the coast should have a certain fixed percent of their energy from solar. We have year-round solar energy and we have wind because they're islands. Most of the country is flushed with wind, but there has to be an incentive to let private capital go in. If you make incentives, money will go into it. And this is the answer to one of the perennial problems of the Caribbean, and the Caribbean is at fault. I suppose that's not a good way to end, but
Well, we can take that in the round, Ambassador. You've said other things about where the Caribbean isn't at fault, but Eric, would you like to address this issue of investment?
Yeah, I will defer a lot to Ambassador Bernal and the panelists. I just wanted to make a comment about one thing we do track here internally is the topic of investment climate. And for a lot of Caribbean countries, there are issues that foreign investors, including American investors, have with systemic issues, and this has to do with corruption, lack of clear standardized rules, so we do, and other things. So this is something we do track, and obviously through a lot of programs that we have, and I've already talked about this through, for instance, capacity building programs that are fantastic through USAID and other partners to basically assist government procurement in particular. We've seen some real gains here, but even with that being aside, the challenges with the investment climate, I do want to add to what Ambassador Bernal said. We see the renewable energy investment as a huge opportunity. And I would say that looking ahead, 2023, I can see that there's going to be renewed activity in terms of high level focus and potentially missions focused on renewable energy, because again, the need is here. We have a lot of US and other private sector firms that are very focused in this area. We want to see, and there's financing too. We just want to make sure that the right for exist and mechanisms so that governments can see the options and move forward. But anyway, I'll leave it at that and appreciate everyone's comments.
Well, thanks. We're out of...
May I just add one thing, which is,
Sure.
while US investment in the region has not grown significantly, there has been investment from Mexico in tourism, in manufacturing. There has been investment from China, etc. We really need to study carefully what is it that is impeding US investment, which is the natural source of investment for the Caribbean.
Thank you. That's maybe a good note to end on. That could be a good policy paper for the CPC and or the center here, the Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU. I think that would be a really interesting one to explore. I wanted to thank all the panelists. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but I think this has been a great discussion. We do plan to have 3 more of these webinars together with the CPC and LAC in 2023 and the rest of the academic year that we have. But I wanted to thank all of you on the panel for being generous with your time and engaging in this very interesting discussion. It's given me a lot of things to look out for. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.